Hello, everyone. It's April 15th, 2020, and this is St. Mark's at Midweek. I'm Matt Wright, and normally I'd have a date to pay Uncle Sam today, but like a lot of other things, that's all out the window. So instead of waiting in line at the post office, I get to share this time with you, which is much more rewarding on every level. In a few minutes, journalist Lucy Grindon talks in depth with Dr. Ray Samoa from City of Hope about how COVID-19 has changed his own professional and personal life. It's a fascinating and thought-provoking interview, so stay with us for that. But first, I get to visit with St. Mark's pastor, the Reverend Carri Patterson Grindon, to check in and see how our unprecedented virtual podcasting, live streaming, Zoom-filled Easter celebration went. Hi, Carri.
Hey, Matt.
Easter, I know from knowing, as they say, a number of my best friends are priests. I have one priest friend who refers to Easter as Hell Week, sort of irreverently.
That's not me,
it's not you.
Just to be clear.
But of all the weeks to be called that in this crazy time, this might be the right week. But I know from talking to you that there was a lot of joy in this Easter. Maybe unexpected joy, maybe some of the expected joys. What does this Easter season leave you with so far?
Well, I will say that the at staff meeting on Zoom this week, we were checking in about this, and for the staff, and particularly those of us who have worship responsibilities.
Yeah.
This was the first Easter, and this might be true of all of our worshipers. I mean, this is the first Easter where people were in their jammies, and I know for some on the staff, they had breakfast at home for the first Easter in their entire lives.
Yeah.
Before going to church and doing their duties there. So it had its charms in that way, I guess I would say. And that said, I think we all would have rather have been at church together.
Yeah.
For sure. And there's a lot of joy in it too. I've talked to a lot of people who both received and delivered meals to members of the community. Mm-hmm. So I think there was probably more sharing of our own Easter feasts with one another than we've ever done before as a St. Mark's community. So that was an incredible thing just to hear about that. I've heard a lot of stories of people gathered in their homes around tables, listening to worship together,
right,
and being fed by that. There's something really great about with these podcasts, our worship being something we can return to. And I know personally, I listened to the podcast on Easter morning from the Brown Library with a candle lit. And then when I got home in the afternoon, my family and I listened to it again together. And so, that's not something we could do any other time, but we have that glorious music from Mark, and those readings, those beautiful readings by all the people. We get to return to those over and over again if we want to, and be fed by them in the weeks ahead. So that's a great thing. Yeah, so I think, it was so radically different than any Easter any of us has ever had, and we continue to find ways to bring joy and to bring hope to one another. So I'm grateful for that.
Yeah. Well, I'm just moved in all of this by the ability for church and our church community to transcend these hardships and for us to come together in whatever way.
That's right.
It's a really unusual way right now, but I still feel at one with my friends and family at St. Mark's.
I do too.
You talked in your sermon about having the Easter blowout of all Easter blowouts when we're finally able to be together. And I think everybody's really looking forward to that.
Yeah. I mean, we talked about that at staff meeting today too. I mean, there's we don't really know when and how that will be. And we recognize that I think I had it in my heart when we first needed to separate from one another, that there'd be this decisive moment where we could be back together in the way I described in my sermon, up close, rubbing elbows with each other, crowded into the church. And I still hope that's true. And I know eventually it will be true. I don't know that our first return to church will look like that.
Yeah.
It may be a gradual thing as it was on the front end of this thing.
Right.
So we will rejoice in whatever way we can, as soon as we can, to be together again. And that'll be fantastic. We'll have a new appreciation just to be in the same space, even if we can't be crowded into it. But I'm telling you, eventually we're going to find a way to really celebrate in a big, big way.
Good.
And we'll do a redo on Easter for sure when that time comes.
Good. Well, St. Mark's Church on Air, Sunday morning, and we'll catch up with you again next week.
Thanks, Matt.
And now we move on to Lucy Grindon's interview with St. Mark's parishioner, Dr. Ray Samoa, a man on the front lines, professionally and personally, in the fight against COVID-19. Lucy and Ray chatted earlier on Zoom.
Dr. Ray Samoa is an endocrinologist at City of Hope. He's also been a member at St. Mark's, along with Nick Arnzen and their kids, for about 6 years. We're talking with him today to get his perspective on the current COVID-19 crisis. So, Ray, I want to ask you first about your work with City of Hope. I know that City of Hope is a comprehensive cancer center, so I'm wondering, what are some of the specific challenges that the coronavirus poses for cancer patients and the institutions that care for them?
So, as you probably are well aware of, COVID-19 is the highest risk of an adverse outcome is in patients that have compromised immune systems, and the elderly. So the nature of cancer is that it generally happens to older individuals. So right off the bat, the predominance of our patients are at risk. And then because of the treatments and the cancer itself, a lot of our patients are immunocompromised. And so we're a high risk center for an adverse outcome. So a lot of our efforts are focused on prevention, and so far so good. They've now, mind you, what the institution is doing now and 3 weeks ago is completely different.
I see.
But that's to be expected. I think other institutions are adapting, as the guidelines from the CDC are changing, as we're learning more about the disease and being conscious about what's happening around us. And so all of that is going into how hospitals are reacting and trying to protect their patients.
A brief note. Ray is now back at work at City of Hope, but a little over 3 weeks ago, he himself came down with a bad flu-like illness, which included a headache, body aches, loss of taste and smell, difficulty breathing, and a cough. He didn't meet the criteria to get tested for COVID-19 when he was sick, but as of yesterday morning, he's gotten his serologic test results back, and he is now immune to the virus that causes COVID-19.
What was the experience of being sick like for you? Was it similar to any illness you've had in the past? And are you pretty convinced that it was COVID-19, or are you still feeling unsure about that?
It's the longest I've ever been sick. I don't think I've ever been sick consistently for 2 weeks. I think that was one of the more pressing things, is that even when I had the flu, there would be times when, it would let up and it would remit.
Right.
You'd feel better for a little bit. This was not like that. This was like there was symptoms consistently throughout, and the
Wow.
fatigue and the muscle aches just were persistent.
Hmm.
And
Did you experience a cough or shortness of breath?
yeah, so the first symptoms I started to have was about day 4 or 5,
Mm-hmm.
where I didn't have a cough yet, but it was difficult for me to lie flat.
Hmm.
So um, as you know, anybody that's accustomed to sleeping in a certain way, it makes it really difficult to find a way to sleep. And that's crucial to the healing process.
Right.
So yeah, and then the cough started to progress. I want to say at the end of the first week, yeah, probably the beginning of the second week, my cough started to increase. It never really was, to me, significantly, like I never felt like the cough was problematic.
Mm-hmm.
Now on day 10, my breathing did get shaky enough where I was having trouble breathing even sitting up.
Mm.
So at that point, that's when I went to the emergency room.
Mm-hmm.
The pulling the trigger in the emergency room was very anxiety provoking.
Yeah.
Um,
Why was that?
well, and mind you, I'm a medical professional, but there were still times like when you can't sleep at night and your breathing's not 100%, when you play this sort of psychological game of, okay, so what's my criteria to pull the trigger? When do I call 911? And, luckily for me, I magically somehow fell asleep, and, was able to get through it.
You were having trouble breathing around day 10, you said, and you were having trouble sleeping because of that. But eventually you said you did fall asleep. So then at one point, did you decide to go to the emergency room? And what was the sign for you that said, okay, now I need to go to the emergency room?
So when the trouble breathing happened, even in positions that normally I didn't have trouble breathing, like I was having some shaky breathing just sitting up and standing. And so at that point, it was time to go to the emergency room.
Right.
And
what were they able to do for you there?
So I have to tell you, Lucy, it was a surreal experience. I guess everyone's been to the emergency room at least once. Mm-hmm. And so you expect long lines, you expect full waiting rooms, you expect to see a lot of delays just because of the process.
Right.
And I have never seen more efficient healthcare.
Wow.
I went to Huntington Memorial and I was expecting the worst, but when I showed up, there was only one person in front of me and they did her intake in 3 minutes and got her to the back. And I was the same way. They did my oxygenation level and that was good. They did my vitals, it was stable. They did a chest x-ray and an EKG and everything turned out normal, which was really, I think, psychologically important for me, that I needed to know that my lungs were okay. Because, and then they discharged me with an inhaler, which helped a lot as well. But every day after that, I got significantly better.
Good.
And so then by day 14, my symptoms were minimal, and by day 15, I had no symptoms.
Wow.
And so that was my experience.
So,
but all in all, that ER visit was 35 minutes.
Wow, that's crazy.
Right? I've never even gone to the back during an emergency room visit in 35 minutes. So,
yeah.
Well, but you know what else? It comforted me to know that people are being very astute about when to go to the emergency room.
Mm-hmm.
And they're not, at least at that point, people weren't overwhelming the system with minimal complaints. I think people are being very astute and using other means to get health advice. Like, I think they're calling their physicians and getting advice that way. I think they're reaching out to medical professionals that they're familiar with, and they're getting information that way. And so people are reducing the visits to the emergency room to decrease their risk of exposure. And I think that's a really important part of this.
Right. Just like you said, people are trying to reduce their risk of exposure. And I know that there is some concern right now about hospitals and emergency rooms being places where the coronavirus can spread. So based on your experience, do you think that concern is justified? And what are some ways to deal with that if you do find that you have to go to the emergency room or the hospital for any reason?
I that's the whole purpose of this social distancing, is to flatten our curves so that our systems will get overwhelmed. And so I think if you have any trouble breathing, in situations that common situations like walking or talking or sitting are difficult, then it's time to go get evaluated. And so at that point, the benefit outweighs the risk of being exposed. If you don't have those symptoms, and there's nothing else pressing going on, then at that point you can call triage centers. Like, you can call your primary doctor. Most of them have phone visit setups. Some of them now have televideo capabilities. So you can reach out to your medical community without the risk of exposure if you have questions. And most times people will be given advice over the phone that do not include going to the emergency room. Very in a minority of cases, though, they do tell them, it's time to go get seen. But these are all now at our disposal, and so I would ask people to use them. The kits have come in, and so now testing is a lot more readily available. And there's actually serologic testing, which I'm going to have done this coming week to see if so serologic testing is to see whether or not you have antibodies to the COVID virus, to SARS-CoV-2, and that suggests that you have immunity, which I don't know how that'll pan out in regards to social distancing, but as far as peace of mind, I think it would do a lot. But I also think that if more people get the coronavirus test and the serologic testing, that will help loosen restrictions a lot more going forward. South Korea has implemented a more widespread testing regimen in their national policy, and it's working. South Korea and the U.S. I think they had their index case around the same time. And South Korea's curve has been relatively flat from the beginning, whereas the U.S., our curve is steep, and it is getting steeper in certain parts of the country. But in parts where they're implementing the social distancing, and a lot of these other initiatives, it's working. It's the curves in as definitely the West Coast, in Washington State and in California, the curves are starting to flatten. So much so that California is lending their ventilators out to other states. there's some criticism about that, but it tells us that the initiatives we're doing is working, and it's working because we're working together.
Right. I'm wondering what the relevance of testing is, given the size of the outbreak in California and the size of the outbreak in the United States. How can testing help us to get things back to normal and keep the size of the outbreak small, or keep the curve flat?
That's a great question. So testing is only useful if you're tracking, right? So widespread testing allows you to identify people who are asymptomatic and isolate them, right? And so that does a significant amount of reduction of spread when you can take the portion of the population that's at the highest risk of transmitting the condition, And so South Korea's, this isn't their first viral pandemic, and they learned a lot from when the Mediterranean respiratory syndrome went through their country. And so a lot of this testing and tracking is implemented because of their experience, and I think one of the things that plagues us in the US is we don't have a national strategy yet. A lot of the initiatives are segregated by state, and even more so by county. Georgia is one good example, where a lot of southern states are showing a significant rise in their COVID cases, but because Georgia, the majority of Georgia lives in Atlanta, and Atlanta just happens to be the headquarters of the CDC, Atlanta pushed these initiatives in really quickly, and so their spread doesn't resemble the numbers you're seeing in a lot of the South, especially in Texas and in Louisiana.
Right.
And so I get sometimes when you're in the four walls and you're inundated with story after story after story, it can plague on your resilience, your mental and your psychological resilience. But from someone who is seeing the numbers and comparing them to other places, the initiatives are working, and had they not been working, I don't think I would be as optimistic. Now, granted, the stay-at-home initiatives are just one piece of the puzzle. The widespread testing that's now made available in Los Angeles or Los Angeles County, that's a big piece that also gives me hope. The serologic testing becoming more readily available, that too helps give me a lot of hope as well. And so, there's also other examples in other countries where these initiatives are working and they're seeing sort of the end of the tunnel. New Zealand, Germany, Taiwan, all of these countries are seeing flatter curves, and a lot of what California is doing resembles what those countries are doing.
Do you think that we'll reach a point where we have so many tests available that a lot of asymptomatic people are able to be tested, or enough asymptomatic people are able to be tested, that it will actually help to flatten the curve, and that people will, at this point, I can't imagine someone asymptomatic getting their hands on a test. Do you think that that's something that will be the reality in the near future?
Not near future. And that's one of the drawbacks of not having a national approach.
Right.
Is that one can't tell whether or not these tests are going to be more readily available. They're available now, and we can test a significant proportion of the population. And so my hope is that people will see reduced rates because of that and make the testing even more available.
My last question for you is, what are some of the best ways that you found to take care of yourself while you were staying home? And what are the best ways in which people who live alone or people who live with their families can sort of prepare for the eventuality that they may have to take care of themselves from home? What are some of the best strategies to prepare for that?
If someone you have has symptoms and you're worried about them having COVID, the best approach at that point is to assume they have it, and you can still wear masks to help sort of reduce the risk of exposure when you're caring for somebody in the house. You do want to try to see if there's a way you can physically have them recover, in an enclosed space. But you can still go in and check in on them. You just have to wear a mask and wash your hands regularly.
Right.
And so, and then if you're alone, this speaks to the importance of community, is that there's physical, emotional, psychological health. And the physical health, making sure you still, do the things that promote a healthy immune system, like getting good sleep, making sure you try to eat healthier, trying to get some type of exercise in daily, and managing your stress. All these things can sort of give your immune system a better fighting chance. In regards to the psychological aspect of it, it's really important to stay connected and engaged. And one of the ways that people are recommending to do that is to still adhere to a schedule. One of the hardest things to do about working at home is adhering to some type of routine. But what they're finding out is that it's a crucial part of how humans process chaos, is to have some type of thing to look forward to do.
Right.
And so part of me coming to work on the weekend is to implement this routine, this schedule, as well, And so, the other thing that I think people need to understand is that the exposure of the virus, and there's a lot of articles going around about this currently, is this concept of a viral load, right? And so the reason why it's important, because these masks are not 100%. Especially, so I have right now, because I'm not actively taking care of anybody with COVID, I have a routine health mask. So, it's the ones that have the loops that go around your ears, and it has that little sort of flexible bridge at the nose to help provide a seal. But those things don't really filter very well. The sides are open.
Right.
And so, one may ask, well, even these cloth masks, they don't have a lot of filtration.
Right.
Like, what good are they? And so these things these barriers that we put up, and washing our hands, these are all ways of keeping your viral load down, even if you are exposed, because what happens when our immune system meets a virus is there's a race. So the race is between the virus replicating itself and your immune system fighting it. So the higher the viral load that you're introduced with, the more of a head start the virus has.
I see.
Right. And so
it's important to limit conceptually the amount of the virus that you get exposed to.
Correct. And so that's why in patients that are treating patients that have active infection, they have a lot more elaborate barrier. They have the N95 masks that are somewhat airtight, and then they have a plastic face shield,
right?
And then they're gloved up and gowned up, And that all of that is to reduce the amount of viral load that's transmitted. Because there is a question whether or not healthcare workers get a more severe form of COVID. And most people think that it's not a different strain, it's just the amount of virus that is contracted when one is dealing, when one is exposed,
Right.
taking care of patients. I've been very touched that I get a view of our community that I don't know I would have been able to see in any other instance, and just the outpouring of people to each other, and the virtual holding of hands across this has been amazing,
Yeah.
And so unfortunately we had to go through this to be able to see that view of us, but I for one am happy to see it.
When you were sick, like what pain medication were you taking? What were you eating? Like what I don't know, what are the specific, like, were you taking ibuprofen? Were you taking acetaminophen? How did you deal with the symptoms day to day?
So in the beginning, the worst part about it was the headache. And there were reports of ibuprofen worsening the condition, although the CDC and other professional groups have come out to say that there's not enough evidence to say that ibuprofen causes a problem when you have COVID.
Right.
But I didn't know that at the time, so I just took Tylenol. And the Tylenol was moderately effective for, maybe an hour to 2 hours at a time.
Did it help if and when you developed a fever?
I don't know if I've ever took it for the fever. I took it mostly, there was a time I was taking it just consistently every 6 hours. And so whether the fever happened or not, it didn't really matter because I was taking it scheduled. It wasn't until I had trouble breathing that the emergency room started, prescribed, what did they prescribe? They prescribed some Mucinex, a cough suppressant, and an inhaler. The inhaler was probably what helped the most. Mucinex I took because I didn't know, I couldn't tell whether or not the congestion was causing any symptoms. And the other medications I didn't take. Because like I said, after that day, things started to get better. So I didn't really need a lot. One of the things that was most striking about this illness was my sense of smell and my sense of taste just completely left me.
Wow.
And, my appetite was really poor. And I think I lost about maybe 12 to 14 pounds. And although I'm a strong advocate for lifestyle modification, that is not a way I would recommend losing weight.
Yeah, definitely not.
No. And so I would force myself to eat things, and I basically stuck to things that were easier to make. So like popcorn, but popcorn tasted like styrofoam.
Oh God.
Because there was just no taste and no smell. And so, I sat there just trying to chew for a little bit. And I would say I forced myself to probably eat like a quarter of the bag, just to keep my strength. Because I noticed like those times I was able to feed myself, the next couple hours felt a little bit better. Like I was a little bit stronger. So
that's good to know. So one piece of advice for somebody who's caring for a family member who has the virus potentially is keep them fed, even if they don't want to eat.
Keep them fed and hydrated, So one of the things I was very mindful, even though my appetite was down, was to stay hydrated. And so there was a lot of water around me. Nick was amazingly kind at how much he stocked, even from afar. And so at that point, when you're trying to stay hydrated, I'm not a big fan of juices and sodas, but if that's the kind of liquids you can take down, then by all means.
That's what you want to have. Okay. And have your senses of taste and smell come back?
Yeah. So when my symptoms started to go away, my sense of smell started to come back, because my sense of smell is my sense of smell is extremely sensitive. Like, it's weird. So, in my clinic, I'm famous for it because I can smell when somebody brings carbohydrates into my clinic.
Wow.
And I can tell you the difference between like a chocolate cookie and chips. Like that's how strong my sense of smell is.
Oh my goodness.
So, when my symptoms started to go away, my sense of smell started to come back. And then I realized it was time to clean up because 2 weeks of living in just grossness, I was like, oh my goodness, I can smell this now.
Wow.
So
that's hilarious.
Yeah, so there was a rapid cleaning.
Wow.
Deep cleaning.
Thank you so much for talking with me, Ray.
You're welcome. Thanks so much for having me.
Lucy Grindon speaking with Dr. Ray Samoa on St. Mark's at Midweek. Thanks for being with us today. And thanks to our associate producer, Emily Wright, for her hard work as she prepares to graduate from college on Friday. Whoop, whoop, whoop. Another update from St. Mark's next Wednesday. Until then, stay safe, stay healthy, and be good to each other. I'm Matt Wright.